Hello, friends. This is the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Tobi. The goal of the AlphaList podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for their company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. Welcome to the AlphaList podcast. I'm your host, Tobi, and today with me is Bob Moesta, who's, let's say, a popular guy in the product world. He is a teacher, builder, entrepreneur, co-founder of the Rewired Group, a design firm in Detroit, Michigan, and he developed and launched over 3,500 products, really, and sold everything from design to services to software, in-house consumer electronics. Like everything. Hey?
Yeah, I've worked on a lot of things.
Bob, what didn't you sell? What didn't you do in your career?
What's very interesting is there was a couple of categories I hadn't worked in, like insurance, and in the last couple of years I've been able to work in kind of just about every category. So I'm not sure I can think of a category I have not worked in, to be honest. I'm sure somebody can find one, but at some point I don't know of one.
And you also you're the co-author of the Jobs to be Done framework.
Yeah. I co-architected with Clay Christensen and some other people, and basically in the early 90s, we basically came up with the idea and used it as a method and a tool, and Clay helped turn it into kind of a theory back in around 2010 to 2016 when he wrote the book Competing Against Luck.
And you're good friends with the Basecamp guys, and also we're consulting them, etc. So a lot of overlaps. And the funniest overlap is just that I yesterday had a podcast recording with Melissa Perry, who wrote Escaping the Build Trap, and your book is called, or one of your books is called Learning to Build.
I love that. Yeah. Well, I think the reason is that there's a pendulum, right? There's a lot of people who don't. My book is really about how I learned how to build. I'm dyslexic, and I was told to be a construction worker or a baggage handler at the airport, and ultimately I was befriended and basically mentored by some really amazing people who poured their knowledge into me to learn how to build. So I've worked on, like I said, over 3,500 different products and services, everything from the Patriot missile guidance system to Pokemon mac and cheese and just about everything in between. And so, and to be honest, it's my curiosity that really has been driven to me. But what really helped me was learning methods and tools of how to build. And so I think there is a build trap for sure. I think people, they don't learn enough around it. And so I think they're very complementary ideas as opposed to actually opposite ideas.
Absolutely. And I think like Melissa's book is about something totally different, and about a problem that many CTOs are facing, that they like continue or start building and instead of thinking about it first, and thinking about the problem space, which is really important, and which is also something that you guys teach, right?
That's right. That's really what Jobs to be Done is about, is being able to put yourself in the shoes of your customer and understand your consumer and your customer, which are sometimes two completely different people, right? The buyer and the user are very different. And so being able to understand kind of their lives and understand what's important to them, as opposed to trying to convince them about things. And what I learned is as an engineering school, so I have a undergrad in electrical engineering and then a mechanical and chemical master's. And so I've been loving to build forever. But what I realized is that the lie I was told when I went through engineering school was build it and they will come. It's just a lie. It doesn't happen.
Well, it's I guess right? It sometimes works, but
yeah, but in most cases, what happens is I build something and then I got to go find of the 8 billion people in the world who needs it. right? Where what I do is I do it the exact opposite way. I go find people with very specific problems that they need to have solved, and then I go develop product for that. And so it's a very different, it's almost like a reverse lens of it. Instead of, boy, what can I build? It's like, who needs something? And then what can I build?
It's essentially like product discovery, right? Really
Yep.
understanding like first customer group, who are they, persona, and then
Well, it's more than that, because here's the thing is that at some point products are actually services. They have to work through space and time. And so what we have to do is, it's not about a persona. It's not just about who, right? That's what I have a problem with personas, is they just tell me who, but it doesn't tell me about when, where, and why. And most of the time what they do is they tell me about their usual behavior. But typically for people to do something new, they have to change their behavior. So how do these people handle change as opposed to what do they do on a regular basis? So you start to realize personas are actually not rich enough for me to actually design better product. That's why Jobs to be Done was kind of created. Is I kept getting a lot of information of who, but then I'd have to guess a whole bunch of other information that wasn't right. I was wrong.
And how do you get from the like understanding the problem space, understanding your target group to the actual change, to the change in
Yeah.
behavior?
So what's so interesting is this, is that if you really study what causes somebody to buy something new. So this is not about what causes somebody to buy the same thing over and over again. It's like, what causes somebody to say, today's the day I need a new mattress. Today's the day I need a new CRM. It's not random. It's very much caused. And you can actually start to see patterns of things that people have to have happen to them to enable them to say, I need something new. And so part of it is the first thing I would say is the struggling moment is the seed for all innovation. If your customer's not struggling with something, then they can't even see something new. So we have to be able to figure out, what are they struggling with? So that's where we start. And then what happens is we basically then understand, how do they go about figuring out how to buy something new, which is very different than how they use something on an ongoing basis today. And so it's a very different process. And so I actually went and learned criminal and intelligence interrogation methods to interview, because most people lie to themselves about why they do stuff, right? It's crazy. And so you start to realize you have to understand that kind of stuff. You have to actually, so the way I talk about it is, most people get afraid when I talk about interviewing them, but it feels like therapy, because most people haven't connected the dots of what happened in their lives to say, today's the day I needed a new coat rack. What was so interesting is I did an interview a couple weeks ago, and it took somebody 18 months to basically think about and finally purchase a coat wrap from Amazon for $137. 18 months. And you start to go, well, why did it take so long? Well, part of it is things had to happen to them to make them ready to buy it. And that's the point is as we understand that, we understand the causation, we then can understand how to design and develop better product.
So if you ask my wife, I'm always ready to buy everything straight away. Is that a personal problem, or?
No, so what I can tell you is, one of the reasons why is because you have very little anxiety force. You don't actually you're not worried about the consequence of buying something and it not working, but you're actually very thirsty to make progress, and to the point where you actually buy things that won't work, but it doesn't bother you, but it bothers your wife tremendously.
Absolutely.
Right? And so part of it is the framework helps us explain your behavior. That's the whole point, is that I can explain people's behavior. The other interesting part is people say, well, there's impulse buys. And when you start to really study them, there is no such thing as an impulse buy. They just didn't plan to buy it. So consumers call it impulse, but when you actually look at what's happened to them and what they're hoping for, so that's the other part of this, is it's not just about the problem, and it's not just about the outcome. It's about the two of them together. It's the context and the outcome together that determines the value, the progress they're trying to make. And that's where we start. And if we can actually understand where people want to make progress and then insert products into those moments, it's way easier to develop. It's actually way more accepted, and it grows way faster.
So do you think people actually, like, if you have that group of people that thinks about buying something, do you think those people are actually searching for the problem they have, or?
So here's the thing: is that what I will tell you is I never talk to people who, for example, I built houses, right? I would never talk to people who wanted to buy a house, because at some point they would tell me they wanted everything and they wanted everything for free. They had no chance to value it. So what I did is I went and interviewed people who bought houses. What did they make trade-offs on? They all wanted this, but they actually bought something else. And by understanding how they went through the buying process, then I could actually help the people who hadn't bought yet. But most people go and talk to the people who want to buy a house, and then they build that, and nobody ends up buying it. Because we're talking about the future, and we're talking about nobody knows what we're going to have for lunch next Thursday. Though I could do a survey that said 37% of the people want a chicken sandwich, to say, oh, we should have a chicken sandwich for lunch. But the reality is, like, we're just still guessing. But if I talk to people who bought a house, it's now a fact. They already bought the house. What in the world had to happen to them to say today's the day that they would leave one house and move to a new house? It's not random.
Absolutely.
And so this is where I'm applying my curiosity as an engineer to behavior and understanding behavior. And what you start to realize is people are irrational, but in context, right? But typically when we see something irrational, it means we don't have the whole story. Most people behave rationally, but it's because they see the world in a different way. And so what happens is, context makes the irrational rational. And so typically when you hear somebody do something that's irrational, you need to actually then understand, you don't understand their context well enough, and you're missing something from their story. And that's the key to being able to understand what products we should be building. Because a lot of times they'll say contradictory things, and ultimately it represents a trade-off they have to make. And we need to understand those trade-offs.
And well, maybe one example, also a personal one again. Like downstairs in my company, I just have a box with a new espresso machine that I just bought.
Yeah.
my wife hates me for that, I think. It was.
Yeah. I've had one for 13 years. I love it.
It's fairly expensive, and I already had a fairly expensive one, which was 10 years old. So you could say like written off. Maybe it was an irrational purchase. I'm not sure. But like, if you ask me today, what was important for me to buy it, it was actually like, yes, I wanted a new one. Plus, I wanted a more silent one. And I wanted an energy-saving one, because I think it's just like
And so this is where I would say this is the lies you're telling yourself of how you justify it to other people, but that's not really. So the thing is and now that you're on the other side, so through time and space, you're on the other side of buying it. You then make up the story of why you bought it. And what we try to do is understand. Let's go back in time and understand what you knew when and why you did it. And what you start to realize is it's about certain things coming together of, for example, the old espresso machine either getting louder or being too loud because all of a sudden there's more Zoom calls. Right. And so all of a sudden it's like, I can hear I could interview you about this if you want, but it would take about 40 minutes. But it's about really interrogating you to say what in the world was going on. Because the old espresso machine worked, right?
It was just very loud, but in the mornings, I wake up earlier than my kids at, let's say, 5:30 or something. And I tend to wake up my kids with through making an espresso in the kitchen. So I think that's reality, or more of reality.
So ultimately, when you bought it the first time, you didn't have children. You weren't thinking about kids. You didn't care about how loud it was. And now the fact is the loud espresso machine wakes up the rest of the house. And to be honest, you didn't buy it for better coffee. You bought it so you could actually not make up the house while you got espresso.
Let's say on the way to purchase, I also learned much more about like making perfect espresso. And then I also know that the one I get out of that new machine is much better.
Is better. So now you're piling out. So part of this, but this is where you could say at the moment you bought it might have been an impulse, but you had been researching it for a long time. And you had been thinking about it for a long time.
Roughly 2 years, potentially, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so this is where we have to look at the entire journey, because at some point in time, I've got to be able to understand how to get in your way and help you along the way with the process. And at the same time, how do I understand the trade-offs you're willing to make in order, again, what are you willing to pay more for? What are you willing to pay less for? Ultimately, to say, today's the day I'm going to buy a new espresso machine. It's not random. It's just not. And so these are the things as a technical person for me to understand these situations. It does three things. One is it gives me common language that when we talk about what the customers means, marketing, sales, and product all have the same definition of what customers mean by the language, which is critical, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is now we actually start to translate those what they want into what are the outcomes that they want and what are the metrics we need to put around it to know that they're making that progress. So it's not just about the output of creating a good coffee. It's about making sure I create a good coffee with a decibel level that's below this amount, right? Because that's part of the job that you're trying to get done, which is I want a great coffee and with little noise, and I'm willing to pay more for it. Right? So, and then third is the trade-offs that the customer is willing to make get translated into the product as opposed to us making the trade-offs because we run out of time. Right? We end up making trade-offs on the product only because we run out of time. And if we actually match them to the trade-offs the customers actually will be willing to make, and to be honest, not like I'm willing to have a little bit less perfect coffee for a lot more less noise.
Yeah. And shorter heat
right?
up
So
time.
this is where and heat up time. So all of a sudden there's trade-offs you're willing to make up. And that's what we're trying to figure out is how do we actually look at those things and understand what are those trade-offs we could make? Because we frame the problem differently as engineers. To me, what's interesting is most people think that we hire engineers because they're supposed to have the answer, but we don't have the answer. We have to actually find the answer. We have to be good at finding answers, and that's really what we want to make sure that our engineers have is the right context, so they can actually search in the right areas, so we don't have to fix the product all the time.
Okay, let's stay with my example. Where does the total addressable market come into play? Like, let's say you're an espresso machine company from Italy, and you wanna produce like the perfect espresso machine, and now you hear from like a few folks, and like through your interviewing technique, what the problem is really, and then you try to solve that problem. Like, how do you make sure you have a proper TAM?
So I think TAM is actually more set up from the supply side, and the way they calculate TAM. I mean, I just actually came from a private equity conference where they talked about TAM and SAM and all these different things. And the reality is, the way I think about it is, what's the serviceable market, right? Not the total addressable market, but the serviceable addressable market. And that means how many people are really struggling. So I could actually count the number of households that could have espresso machines and say, these are all the possible people who could have espresso. But ultimately, what are the things that have to happen to them to pull espresso into their lives? That actually makes it more real in terms of that number. And so you start to realize that at some point, not everybody needs a new payroll system, but people who have had these kinds of things happen to them need new payroll systems. And so I can actually talk more about the true serviceable market as opposed to the total addressable market.
Understood. And how can I apply it? I mean, obviously you're a pro. You did it like 30 times, 3,500 times. Sorry,
I've done it,
or even more.
I've done so many interviews. Yes.
How do you apply it? Like, how can anyone apply it?
I think the first thing is to actually take a moment to take a step back to understand the core question that if you could understand the answer to it, it would answer and unlock a lot of the other questions. So, like, again, what causes somebody to say today's the day they need a new CRM? If I can answer that, I might be able to answer a lot more questions. And so first of all, we do is we actually spend time trying to frame the question the right way, that it's large enough. And it's almost like what I talk about is doesn't have any hypotheses. It's more about like this. I know, for example, people bought a new mattress, but I have no idea why. Let me actually then hear their stories and build hypotheses from it. So I call it hypothesis building research, as opposed to hypothesis proving research. Most of the research I was taught was the scientific method of creating a hypothesis and then testing it. But the reality is, what do you do when you're not smart enough to even form a hypothesis? Right? And so part of it is framing the right question. The other part is then basically studying, and the one key framework I would talk about is this framework called the forces of progress, and that there's 4 forces that are involved in helping people change. There's a push of the situation, something about the current situation that causes them to say what they're doing is not going to work, and we need to understand that. And then there's an outcome, basically a pull of the new solution, which is the outcome that they're hoping for that they can't do today, that would actually help them make progress. And those are the 2 fuel forces. And then there's 2 frictional forces. One is the anxiety of the new, of, how do you use it? How am I going to pay for it? What do I do with the old one? All the anxieties about putting something new in. And then there's another force of the habit of the present, which is the stuff that they already have in place and ultimately are hard to change. And so you start to realize if the push and the pull are not greater than the habit and the anxiety, you can't actually change. And so by studying these people and studying people who've bought houses or have bought CRMs or have bought your product, and understanding when did they know what, right? Because it's not about just when they bought it. It's like, when did they have the first thought? When did they passively look? How did they actively look? What decisions did they make and what trade-offs did they have to make? Ultimately, how did they decide? By understanding that journey and the forces at play, that's how you end up doing this. And so I know it sounds a little complicated, but the reality is ultimately you're trying to understand what causes people to say today's the day they need something new.
So it actually reminds me a bit of the AIDA model. I guess you know it, right?
I don't know that.
Awareness, interest, desire, and action from marketing theory, essentially.
Yep.
That you have to think it through.
Well, and this is. So it's I would say it's they're parallel kind of concepts, because mine is like, at some point you have to be people are problem aware and solution unaware, and then they become problem aware and they actually have a refinement of the problem. So it's almost like a P2, problem 2, and then they have a solution set, and then ultimately they have to make trade-offs to pick one, because not everyone is exactly alike, and they have to match it to their situation. So they have to match the context and outcome to the product. And so ultimately it's about putting all those things together. So I think of it as set theory of what are the sets of things that have to happen, and what are the sets of things the product has to have to map together.
And what are the other building blocks of jobs to be done? Is that like the essential one, or?
Yeah, so the essential one is the forces, and the other one is called the timeline, which is the passive looking, first thought, passive looking, active looking, deciding, first use, and ongoing use. And that's about how people go from one habit to another habit. And it's ultimately how do we actually understand how people want to buy? So instead of deciding what our sales process is, what we've been doing is helping people think about it as, how do people buy, and how do we map the sales process to how people want to buy, as opposed to how do we want to sell. Right? It's an engineer's approach to the whole thing. It's like, you got to remember, I'm an engineer trying to make sense of marketing and sales.
So I can also imagine that this worked out quite well for Jason Fried and Ryan Singer, etc.
GHH, yep, and Ryan.
And I think they are a great example, because they are a bootstrapped SaaS, really like founder operated. Is that a client group that you often have, or like a peer group you often see?
We've done. We do everything from bootstrap to basically, kind of angel led. I do Techstars and Y Combinator, so I do some of that kind of stuff as well. But then we will help people in Series A, Series B, and then sometimes we help big corporations as well. Right. So it's and in most cases this has been applied in many different, almost every different vertical that you can imagine, we've applied it in. I mean,
what was the most unexpected application of the framework you have seen?
Yeah, so I think it was a few years ago, and I was doing some work for Clay, and we were looking at he's Mormon, and one of the things we were doing is what caused people to join the Mormon Church and leave the Mormon Church. And what you started to realize is some of the competitors to organized religion were things like SoulCycle and CrossFit. And that people would use, they basically said, well, I went there because, I needed to build a stronger sense of myself. I wanted to help others. Like all of a sudden you start to realize that on Sundays, instead of going to church, they go to CrossFit. you start to realize that they compete with each other. Right. And so in some places you start to realize like, okay, like, well, that's very interesting. But at some point when somebody wants to get married or somebody passes away, like CrossFit can't help you. What do you do? And so you start to realize that religion has basically done a lot of different things for a long time. And it's almost like specialized things have been coming in to actually steal the attention to other places. It's very interesting. But I didn't even think of applying it there.
So in right? front of every Church of Scientology, you find a CrossFit ad these days. Then,
yes,
or
right.
maybe you should.
Right. That's right.
Okay,
that's right.
That's interesting. What like implementing it actually like? Would it be like? Would you recommend to read the book or?
Yeah. So I think there's a learning to build is just about the 5 skills. What I did is I kind of looked at, I'd worked with so many people and I had such great mentors and I had learned so many different things that I kind of took like the top 1% or 5% of the people that I work with who are just amazing innovators and say, all right, what did they know that these other people didn't know? And so it's really distilling that down. And so it kind of goes through what are those skills. And one of them is called Uncovering Demand, where we talk about it. But there's another book I wrote called Demand Side Sales. And that actually has the entire process of understanding how people buy and how to translate it to both sales, marketing, and product. And that might be a little bit better one to look at. But the real thing is to pick, to be honest, if your product already exists, right? It's like talk to the last, 10 people or find the widest group of 10 people who've recently bought your product and talk to them about why they bought. And every time they mention the product, you go like, well, why was that important? Every time they mention a feature, it's like, well, what could you do that you couldn't do before? And ask them about how, because this is about taking a step back to see their life and how your product fits into their life, right? The other part is by doing this in a cross-functional way, the technical people hear it, the marketing people hear it, the sales people hear it, and though they'll twist it, what happens is out of this comes a very common language of when people say this, they mean that. So for example, when people say, oh, I want it to be easy, it turns out there's 22 dimensions of easy. Easy to buy, easy to store, easy to open, easy to install, easy to uninstall. Easy, like, what does easy mean? And you start to realize, like, well, we can't do all versions of easy. And so it helps everybody realize that we just don't say easy, faster, cheaper, and then say leave it at that. And so it's getting down to the right level of granularity so we understand the requirements we have to go build or the trade-offs we have to go make.
Understood.
Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling and going a little too deep in some places.
It's great.
Not
It's
deep
great.
enough
It's great.
Others. So hopefully I'm, because this is the best way to do this.
What about quantitative versus qualitative? I mean, it's mostly qualitative. What how do you feel about?
So what's very interesting is I do like quantitative, but the reality is what I realize is that we don't actually understand the variables well enough to actually go do quantitative first. And so part of this is actually discovering and identifying the right variables, the right contextual variables, the right outcome variables to actually help us describe what is the situation people find themselves in and what are the outcomes they really want. And it's not the features and benefits. Features and benefits are about the product, right? At some point in time, it's when the product meets the customer in the situation, then you can have features and benefits. I want to know their context and outcome before they meet the product, right?
Yeah, so this would actually be then the second step, that when they meet the product, then like it's just an additional layer, right?
Then we can do quantitative.
Just an additional layer.
That's right. So the way I describe it is I try to do qualitative to understand where the edge of language exists and then where I need to create prototypes to actually have interaction and create quantitative data. And so the qualitative is I still need the words because the words are how people actually have to find and select. So if I don't connect it to the words, I'm kind of screwed. So I need to start with the words and then connect it back to experiences.
And how do you apply it in an iterative way? Like, is it something you do one off? Like, did Jason call you at a certain day and say, hey, can you help me? Or do you?
So the first thing is I built this as kind of a frustration of every time I'd want to go do research, it became this big exercise of trying to do something, and it took, anywhere from 4 months to 12 months, and it was like anywhere from $500,000, 200,000 to 500,000 to $1 million to do any kind of research that I wanted to do through the typical marketing research channel. That would have relevance to me. And so I just built something that said, how do I just do a few interviews so I can understand what's going on? So we can do this in about 3 weeks, right? So we typically do it when we have bigger questions on what we call the demand side. And so you don't need to do it that often, and you don't need to do many, because it's not about statistical significance. It's about identifying the variables, and you can see them. The patterns start to emerge very, very quickly. With 7 to 10, if you will, but by 10 to 12, we usually cover 80% of the variables we need. That we can see then what's going on, and then we can build quantitative around that.
Understood. What do you think about like cross-functional collaboration? I mean, who does it typically? Like who does the interviews? Is that like the product manager, or who does it? And
so in really good organizations, they actually, all of them can do them. All different parts of the organization can actually be part of the interview. And so sometimes it might be product and marketing. Sometimes it might be sales and customer success. But usually it's either. So in small organization, this usually starts in product, right? But in some organizations, this might start in marketing. And ultimately it starts in one of those two areas, and then from there it kind of, but it usually has to be cross-functional, because it's really about building the alignment of the language and a common understanding of what people mean. That literally most disconnects and most rework happen in the process because we've misinterpreted what people said. Right. And so that's really one of the bigger benefits of all this, is the alignment. And if product takes usually twice as long as you think, it's typically because we're not clear on the language.
I was asking that because many people with an engineering background actually try to like guess the problem really and jump to the solution straight away, and maybe don't even like take product seriously. To be honest, like the product came up with that. Where is it from?
Yeah. So what's really interesting is, so again, as starting as an engineer and realizing, like, again, I think for me the greatest gift I got is that I was dyslexic, because to be honest, as a dyslexic, I know I'm going to start with a D, not an A, right? And so ultimately I know I have to work for it. And so the thing is most people who get A's, and the way they taught us in engineering school was, we already know the answers. Our job is to have the answers, is to come up with the answers. But the reality is, when you start to look at it, most of our first answers are always usually wrong. And the way we learned in engineering school is people gave us the problems. But now as we redefine the problems, we actually have to think about it very, very differently. And so to me, was my whole thing is I kept being wrong about how I assumed the answer or the solution was. And I did it enough that I realized that I had to listen to what the customer wasn't telling me what they meant and what they said, like what the words they used, and what I interpreted was where it was broken down. So I actually had to really spend the time to understand what they meant by things, because it was so easy for me to jump in logic to say, oh, if they say, boy, I'm struggling because it's too slow. Oh, they want it faster. The reality is I'm struggling, it's too slow. And what they want is they want more. More and faster are not the same.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is where engineers, we are very fast thinkers, but what happens is sometimes the customer is not as fast as we are, and we end up over engineering the product as opposed to actually making something they want.
Yeah, that's why I was asking, like assuming something too early is not a good idea.
Well, if you think about it, 70% of our life cycle costs are fixed in the first 10% of how we develop and set up a new platform. And yet we spend all the money usually on the back end.
Absolutely.
And we don't spend that time up front thinking. And so the more we can spend that time up front thinking about the right things and the boundaries and understanding kind of the limitations, we then will actually have a better understanding of what to build and what to develop.
And that's actually time spent together. because
Yes.
it's important for all of us. That's my understanding and my learning.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks a lot. Very, very helpful. What do you think about other methods like Marty Kagan's book inspired? I guess you read it, etc. Like, what do you think other approaches?
I think this is, so the thing is most people ask me, like, what do you have an innovation process? And what I say is that the innovation process is really dependent, to be honest, to the industry, the company itself, and the set of products that you're actually competing with, and that there's no one way to look at a generalized process, at least from my perspective, right? And so ultimately, it's about skills, and what skills do people need to have. And so I think of, like, what Marty taught. Well, everybody has these different set of skills, and what I think companies have to do is they have to be able to figure out how to assemble the set of skills that build the culture they want. The skills create the culture, right? Or the lack of skills also create the culture.
Absolutely. Okay, so there's no ultimate.
I don't think, like, there's people who are trying to say jobs, I'd rather do this versus jobs, or personas versus jobs. And, like, I know how, like, to be honest, personas can be helpful and jobs can be helpful, and I know how to use them both together. And the real question is it useful to help you make progress with your product or with your company? And so ultimately that's the question. And so I think of these as complementary sets of tools as opposed to overlap or competing sets of tools.
Okay. If you could give my listeners, CTOs who often feel they know what their customers want, three tips, like what would it be?
Yeah. So I think the first one is two things: try to take a step back and, one, find the struggling moments that they have that they want to address. There's a difference between the way I say it is bitchin' ain't switching. Just because people complain about it doesn't mean they want to do anything about it. So what you want to do is look for where people have workarounds for things, or they've actually figured out how to export it and then import it and then do this and then do, like, where do your customers really struggle? So instead of starting with what can you do with your product, you need to be able to actually understand kind of like, where do they struggle? If you have a bunch of things you can do, how do you actually map them to help people in their struggling moments would be another way to think about that. The second thing I would suggest is to think about the progress they're trying to make. Think of the almost the state they are in, and ultimately what are the outcomes that they're seeking, and if they get them, what would be the benefit for them? And so it's not about the outputs, but ultimately you can then understand how much you can charge, or the value they're willing to put on it, in terms of how they'll think about it. So as you can see the progress and think about the progress they're trying to make before we think about the product or service. And then the third thing I would say is, ultimately, we always never have enough time, money, or resources to actually build the perfect thing we want. And so, to be honest, what I would say is, when you're really working with the customer, try to figure out the things that don't matter at all, that you can suck at, that you actually doesn't matter if it works or doesn't work. Because at some point we try to end up trying to be perfect in everything, and we end up being perfect in nothing. I think Jason Fried says it best: you're better off with a kick-ass half than a half-ass whole. And so how do you actually figure that out and make sure you understand what we don't need to worry about? So, like, if you look at Southwest Airlines here in the US, right, they don't worry about snacks. Nobody's not going to fly them because their snacks suck. And if you tell them their snacks suck, they don't care, because they're not going to, they know what the 4 or 5 important things are, which is on-time flights, going to places, that are, if you will, kind of remote, and at the same time being the lowest cost fare and on time. That's it. Like, if the snacks suck, they'll bring their own snacks, but they're not actually accommodating for everything, and they know what they can suck at.
Did you consult them, or?
No, it's just an observation.
Okay, great.
But I do actually do a lot of work in that space, because most people try to be good at everything and they just can't.
Absolutely. And I can imagine that, like, you really flexed your observation muscle, right, throughout the years, like.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the whole thing is as what I would say, you become Neo from the Matrix when you can start to see struggling moments everywhere. And you know right exactly what, like, oh, I can put that there. Oh, I could do that. And you just start, and like at some point they become distracting because you can see where opportunity is just about everywhere.
I see struggling moments.
Yes, exactly.
So
I was in the airport the other day and it was like I was counting them. I got to like 137. I'm like, okay, I gotta stop.
That's great. I still have a little surprise for you as a closing question. So Jason Fried actually told me about a secret Easter egg that he built into Basecamp after like doing your interview techniques and working with you. So it came up through your research. I don't know if you knew. And DHH secretly developed it, and it's like hidden in the product, and you really have to know it. There's like a hidden prompt where you can actually enter you can select a person, and you can enter a year, and then you travel back in time, like physically, to that year, and you end up in that person's life, and I now select you because you obviously still have a user at Basecamp in their product.
Yeah.
In the project they organize their product with. And I now select 1985. And you were back then working as supplier quality engineer at the Ford Motor Company. And
Yes,
we
I
can
was.
now observe yourself for a while. I think you started as student intern and it really like
So I started as an intern. To be honest, I got an internship from a gentleman by the name of W. Edwards Deming, who was Dr. Deming. He's the one who's the father of lean. I thought he was somebody's grandfather. I actually sat down next to him and had a conversation with him. I asked him, he said this to me, I asked him 52 questions in 22 minutes and said, I'm one of the most curious people he's ever met. And he asked me if I'd be his intern for the summer. And so that's how I got into Ford Motor Company. And basically I ended up going to Japan and being part of the very front line to help kind of reduce product development cycle time from 70. It used to take 72 months to develop a car from concept to customer.
Really introducing agile processes, essentially, right?
That's exactly right. And we did parallel. We went and learned lean basically at Toyota, and then brought it back and applied it in 1985 to 1992. That's all I did is basically, and I did it in the US, I did it in Europe, and basically did it through the supply chain and helped reduce product development cycle time to 36 months. So we cut it in half.
Great.
And made quality better and extended the life of the vehicle simultaneously. So we went from 60,000 miles to 100,000 miles.
That's really great. But
sorry, you're bringing me now. You just opened the door.
The box of Pandora. The box of Pandora.
It's like wait. Be careful now.
We all see that, right? Like we all understood it, and now you have the chance to whisper something into young Bob's ears. What would you whisper yourself?
Yeah. The first thing I would say is I would tell myself to slow down. I was moving very, very quickly, and I was not being as diligent as I should have. And I should have relished the time with these people because they were brilliant and they taught me so much. But there's times where I wish I was paying more attention. I think that would be the first thing is that these people in your life, though they seem like that they're your boss or that you're a colleague or whatever, at some point in time they're way more special than that. And to be honest, I do this now is like I try to be in the moment with everybody who's with me because you want to be so mindful of what's going on. And so that's the one piece of advice I would give myself.
I think that's a good advice. Like really learning how to focus and not saying yes to everything.
Yes, all that. That's a good one. That's a good question.
Thanks a lot. So thanks for being my guest here. Really great.
My pleasure.
Guest, good content, and looking forward to getting.
Hopefully the CTOs can relate to what I'm talking about. Like I feel like I had to go to the dark side which is like the sales and marketing side, because I felt like they were feeding me a whole bunch of wrong information. And so I end up having to try to do it myself, but I didn't have the right method. So I end up kind of flipping over the lens and going like, okay, I'm going to go in here and figure this out. And so, it's like, I'm a nerd at heart, and it's just one of those things where I love to build, but it's like at some point, like I do feel like I have to play this demand side strong, because at some point it's like from a product perspective and an engineering perspective, I feel like it's our blind spot.
Absolutely,
we almost assume we already know, and it's one of those things. Having spent now 30 years of my life studying why people change, it's just so much easier for me to develop product because I don't have to try to go find people who want it. I actually know what to go build because the problem's obvious.
I can imagine it straight away. Let's go.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of cheating, right? It's a form of a cheat, but at some point it's very, very successful and useful for me.
I think it's like just a quicker path to dopamine normally, right? That's why we do
it.
Yeah,
that's right. That's exactly right.
So, Bob, thanks a lot for being my guest, and hope to get you over to Germany at a certain point. Let's work on that.
Yeah. We'll work on that.
Have a great day, and hope to see you soon.
Yep.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the AlphaList podcast. If you like this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. AlphaList is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to cto@alphalist.com. Send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on AlphaList, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.